Good morning and welcome to the amazing, vibrant, and diverse riding of Hamilton Centre. The City of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchases 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. My name is Margaret Bennett, and I am proud to be the Liberal candidate for Hamilton Centre. Thank you to all of you for being here, and a special thank you to Soccer World for hosting us. One of the highlights for me this week that I'm sure all of the other Hamilton candidates would agree on is how wonderful it has been hearing the sound of children in schoolyards again. It's lovely to be here in a wonderful space for children and families to play. I know that all of the candidates across the country are hearing stories about how important safe spaces are for families, whether it's their own, their extended families, or oftentimes the families in their neighborhoods that make for vibrant communities. It is my honor to introduce the candidate for University Rosedale, Chrystia Freeland.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Margaret. Hi, everybody. It is wonderful to be here in Hamilton with our great team, with Margaret, with Philomena, with Chad, with Lisa, with Vito. Last week, we released our plan for Canada. It was fully costed, clear, and transparent. It's a detailed plan to finish the fight against COVID and to make Canada even stronger than ever. 2 days ago, the Conservatives finally published their own costing, 23 days after releasing what they called a platform. Although without numbers, it's really hard to describe it that way. What I want to talk about is a very clear contrast which those numbers have shown. A very clear choice that Canadians have to make in this election. Un élément essentiel de notre plan. Une priorité pour moi, une priorité personnelle pour moi, en tant que mère, en tant que féministe, en tant que quelqu'un qui croit que c'est possible d'avoir une croissance économique plus forte au Canada. Cet élément est un plan de créer un système universel, national, de garderie et d'apprentissage au Canada. Depuis plus de 50 ans, les féministes et les femmes et les mères dans notre pays ont travaillé pour créer ce système. Maintenant, c'est vraiment possible de le faire. Et le choix est aux Canadiens. C'est pour les Canadiens de décider. Est-ce que nous voulons ça? Je pense que oui. Et je pense que ça doit être une des questions clés dans les élections. Dans notre budget, on a fait un choix absolument clair. On a investi 30 milliards de dollars dans un système de l'apprentissage et de la garde des jeunes enfants. And this is not just a paper promise. It's not just a promise that we tabled in the April budget. We immediately got to work. And you know what? We have results to show Canadians. We already have agreements on early learning and childcare with 8 provinces and territories across Canada that will bring down costs for Canadians by 50% by the end of next year and will deliver $10 a day childcare within 5 years. This is something that can be done, that we can do. The numbers that the Conservatives revealed this week show very clearly that is not what the Conservatives would deliver. The Conservatives would tear up those agreements. The Conservatives would not invest in early learning and childcare. That is a mistake for Canadian children, for Canadian women, and for the Canadian economy. And this is a fact, guys. This is not an abstract theory. The Quebec experience has shown unequivocally that investing in early learning and childcare is not just a huge relief for families. It doesn't just suddenly make life affordable. It drives economic growth. So I really want Canadians, I want Canadian women, I want Canadian parents, I want Canadian grandparents in this election to realize we have a choice. We can choose at long last to have a universal system of early learning and childcare. And that choice means choosing our Liberal Party. Now, it wasn't really a surprise for us that the Conservatives, as was revealed in the costing of their platform, don't want to invest in early learning and childcare, because we've already seen their track record. And their track record is not standing up for Canadian working families. And I know people in Hamilton remember something that I remember so clearly, and that is in our 232 tariff fight, the fight over the steel and aluminum tariffs. Aaron O'Toole stood up in the House of Commons, and in a question to me, he said, you know, Canada's dollar for dollar retaliation, that's dumb. We knew it was actually really smart, and we knew that sometimes you have to do hard things to stand up for Canadian workers. And we stood up for the steel workers of Hamilton, and I'm really proud that we did. I'm also proud to tell you that thanks to the remarkable resilience of Canadian workers, including the hardworking, the really tough people here in Hamilton, and thanks to the unprecedented economic support our government provided, the Canadian economy is coming roaring back. Yeah, you can clap. And that's not just an assertion. On our side of the political debate, we say things based on facts. The labor force numbers released today showed that 90,000 jobs were added in Canada in August. We have now recovered 95% of the jobs lost during the COVID recession, compared to 76% in the United States. Now, I attribute that overwhelmingly to hardworking, resilient Canadians, but I know the government support has given you a helping hand, and I'm glad we were there to do that. And we are not going to rest until we recover every single job lost, and do more than that until we hit that $1 million job target. So I want people to really be clear about the economic choice we all face, the choice about jobs, the choice about supporting working families, the choice clearly, starkly, about building a universal system of early learning and childcare, $10 a day within 5 years, 50% reduction in cost by the end of next year. And guys, we can really do this. Canada is we're just one election away from finally getting this done. I know that that's what Canadian families, Canadian women, Canadian mothers need, and I'm calling on you to join us and to move forward together. Et maintenant, j'ai le très grand plaisir, le très grand honneur d'accueillir notre leader extraordinaire, Justin Trudeau.
It is now my privilege to introduce the leader of the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for welcoming us here to this beautiful riding. Thank you, Chrystia, for your words. Thank you also to our amazing Hamilton team, Philomena Tassi, our Minister of Labour, but also Vito, Chad, and Lisa as well. We really have extraordinary people across the country who've stepped up to serve their communities, to build a better future, and it is such a pleasure to stand with this amazing team. Je veux aussi reconnaître aujourd'hui qu'ici à Soccer World, on ressent vraiment cette rentrée, cet automne positif. On a vu à quel point d'avoir des enfants autour, d'entendre les enfants jouer derrière nous, ça nous encourage pour les mois à venir. I also, and I wanted to start with this, I know some of you are worrying because you saw it in the debate last night. I talked to my mom for her birthday this morning, and she's not mad at me that I revealed her age to everyone. You know, she sends her best. Everyone says keep up the hard work across the country. We all want to get back to normal, and lots of us are doing exactly that because so many of us have done the right things through this pandemic. We've stepped up, we've gotten vaccinated, we've worn masks, we're washing our hands, we're being there for each other. And the one group that has been there for people more than just about anyone else have been our frontline healthcare workers. I got to visit a whole bunch of them again yesterday at the Ottawa General Hospital, and I got to hear from them both how exhausted they are, but also how proud they are of having been able to pull us all through this pandemic, because they worked unbelievably long hours. They were there as our healthcare systems across this country were stretched and stressed and yanked on and exhausted, but they were there to keep Canadians safe. And right now, as we enter this third wave, they're getting overwhelmed by unvaccinated people ending up in ICUs with COVID. We're seeing surgeries and emergency operations delayed everywhere across the country, or in many places across the country. And it reminds us just how much we have to learn from the lessons of this pandemic. The first lesson we need to learn is, wow, Canadians really step up to be there for each other. We have to continue to encourage that and support that and hold on to that thing that makes us stick up for each other as Canadians. The other thing we learned is we need to invest more money in our healthcare system. I don't understand how anyone could come through this pandemic and say, you know what our healthcare system needs? Less investment over the coming years. That's what I want to dwell on a little bit for this morning. We've put forward a $25 billion plan over the coming years that is going to invest in more primary care physicians, more primary care teams of nurses, better access for families, for individuals to have a family doctor. Why is that important? Well, one of the things we saw that counters hesitancy in people who are still hesitant to get vaccinated more than just about anything else is having a trusted, personal doctor who engages with you, who you know, who's followed you for a while, who understands your concerns, who knows your personality, convince you and tell you that it's safe for you to get vaccinated. But millions of Canadians still don't have access to a primary health care team. That's why That is a big part of the investments we're committing to in the coming years. We also recognize that backlogs in surgery because of COVID, because of other things, because of backlogs that existed before, need to be taken care of. So we're injecting massively in that. But we're also moving forward on better healthcare investments because, let's be honest, we always, and we've over the past number of years, seen how important it is to invest in mental health for people. This pandemic, the extra stresses, the extra pressures, we know the time is now for real investments in mental health. And now that the Conservatives have finally released the costing of their platform, we can actually compare what the various parties' commitments are to healthcare. Let me put it in perspective for you. Yes, we put forward a $25 billion plan on things like doctors, backlogs, and mental health. But just that element on backlogs, in our first year, next year, right now, we will be investing $6 billion to make sure that provinces and territories can catch up on the backlogs of surgeries. That $6 billion is more than Erin O'Toole is proposing to spend on healthcare in the next 5 years on everything from mental health to transfers to the provinces to Indigenous health. We're spending more just on one part of our plan to support Canadians in 1 year than they're spending over the next 5 years. So don't for a second let Erin O'Toole pretend that he understands the need to invest in healthcare, because despite what he says, the numbers don't show it. And that's what we're beginning to see more and more from these Conservatives, that they'll try and say anything to convince Canadians that they're moving in the right direction, that they get our priorities. But when you actually scratch the surface, turns out it's not true. We see it on his completely ridiculous promises on healthcare, where he talks about a detailed plan on healthcare of $60 billion over the coming years, except the detail he forgot was the money, because none of that money flows in the first years. And now is when we need the federal government to step up and partner with the provinces on big investments. But that pattern of not leading but misleading is something we're seeing more and more from Erin O'Toole. Que ce soit sur les armes d'assaut. Encore une fois, on a vu que dans sa plateforme, il y avait écrit noir sur blanc qu'il allait rendre légal, encore une fois, les armes militaires de style assaut que nous avions bannies il y a plus d'1 an. Puis ensuite, il a essayé de dire non, 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 c'est pas vrai, on va pas le faire. Mais on sait qu'il est dans la poche du lobby des armes à feu et pour trancher, regardons sa plateforme, regardons les coûts et comment il a élaboré sur quoi il va dépenser. Il n'y a pas une scène pour le rachat des armes d'assaut qu'on a rendues illégales. Il ne va pas garder l'interdiction qu'on a mise sur les armes d'assaut. Il n'y a personne qui veut ça. Il prétend être pro-choix, on l'a entendu hier soir. Mais être pro-choix, surtout quand on est leader politique, c'est d'assurer que tous ces candidats, tous ces députés soient là pour protéger les droits des femmes. Or, malgré son supposé leadership, 80 de ces députés ont voté contre le droit de choisir d'une femme dans le dernier Parlement. C'est ridicule, mais c'est un pattern clair. Il dit oui, on a un plan pour l'environnement. Ben, son plan pour l'environnement, c'est de revenir en arrière sur la vision Harper, les cibles Harper, qu'on est déjà en train de dépasser. Alors, ce n'est pas juste qu'il va nous arrêter dans notre ambition, il va revenir en arrière sur notre ambition. Les Canadiens ne doivent pas être bernés par cette approche qui veut nous ramener en arrière. C'est pas ça du leadership. Et pour pouvoir rebâtir l'économie, pour pouvoir s'assurer que ces enfants aient le meilleur avenir possible, pour lutter contre les changements climatiques, pour créer des emplois, il faut en finir avec cette pandémie pour de bon. We need to end this pandemic for good if we're going to rebuild our economy, if we're going to get people back to normal. If she's going to have a better future. We're not going to get there if we don't end this pandemic for good. And again, Erin O'Toole says, I will make sure that 90% of Canadians get vaccinated in the coming 2 months. Well, listen, in the past 2 months, he hasn't been able to convince 90% of his candidates to get vaccinated. So how can we believe him on ending this pandemic? He's better and quicker to stand up for the rights of those who choose not to get vaccinated than he is for your rights and your kids' rights to be safe from COVID-19, because these kids, they can't get vaccinated yet. And Erin O'Toole thinks it's okay for when you get on a plane or a train, maybe the person sitting across the aisle from your child isn't vaccinated. And it's not about punishing people. It's about making sure that those who have done the right things to keep their communities safe will continue to be safe. That's what's at stake here in this election. That's why we're having this election. And I think what people saw last night in the debate was there are really, really deep disagreements about which way this country needs to go, about how we move forward, whether it's on an even more ambitious plan to fight climate change and create jobs, whether it's on more investments in healthcare right now to help families across the country, whether it's on childcare, as Chrystia said, to save families across the country thousands and thousands of dollars a year by getting childcare costs cut in half within the next year and down to $10 a day over the coming years, while at the same time creating 250,000 new spaces across the country. That's the plan we're offering, not just for families, but for economic growth and jobs. That's the plan that Erin O'Toole wants to tear up. The choice is clear in this election, and don't let Jagmeet Singh tell you there is no difference between a Liberal government or a Conservative government. Because quite frankly, maybe it makes no difference for the NDP as long as they get to hold that balance of power they're looking for. But it makes a difference to Canadians whether or not there is a progressive government in this country fighting climate change, standing up for women's rights, making sure guns are controlled, making sure assault weapons remain illegal, making sure that we are continuing to step up to have people's backs every step of the way. The choice Canadians make in this election matters deeply, and it matters deeply because the decisions that their government takes in the coming months will define how we end this pandemic, yes, but also how we build a better future for the years and the decades to come. That's why Canadians need to be choosing the direction of this country. That's why I am so excited about the opportunity to keep moving forward for everyone. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. We'll start the question period, 20 minutes, one question, one follow-up, starting with Mia Rapson, Canadian Press.
Good morning. The April budget projected a labor market recovery, full labor market recovery by this summer. We're not quite there yet. The jobs numbers today suggest we still aren't quite there yet. What kind of jobs are you still promising to bring back, and how are you actually going to do that?
First of all, in terms of recovering our economy, the most important thing is to put an end to this pandemic once and for all. Yes, the labor force numbers are very good. Lots of full-time jobs. We're now at 95% recovered all the jobs that were lost during this pandemic. which compares very favorably to 76% recovery in the United States, for contrast. But there is much more to do. That's why we're continuing in our supports for small businesses, for workers, for families, for people who want to work but who don't find the jobs yet, because in certain sectors we can't recover. But at the same time, we know that making those deeper investments in the recovery and in the greener transformation of our economy. Take right here in Hamilton. We're investing in Dofasco to make sure that over the coming years, they replace the coal furnace with an electric arc furnace, which will not only improve the quality of the extraordinary work that our folks here in Hamilton are able to do and the competitiveness around the world, but will significantly reduce our greenhouse emissions. We know that in order to recover our economy, we have to end this pandemic for good, and we're the only party with a plan to do that, because Erin O'Toole can't stand up to the anti-vaxxers in his own caucus.
Following up.
You mentioned this morning your $25 billion promise on health care. The premiers aren't asking for $25 billion over 5 years for targeted measures or things that you with strings attached. They want $28 billion immediately to help fix their health care systems. Why are you not offering them that?
I think Canadians know that we need better healthcare systems across the country. We saw that during this pandemic. And the things that we know from premiers and from talking with Canadians is more primary care doctors is a priority for everyone, because that leads to a better outcomes and better service for Canadians, better care for Canadians. We know that investing massively in mental health, including with 1,200 new counselors in colleges, universities across the country to help young people handle mental health, but also billions of dollars to fix the backlogs in surgeries and in treatments that have accumulated through COVID and before. These are things that all Canadians want. And yes, we respect Premier's delivery on health care, but we are going to make sure that the investments the federal government puts towards health care across the country delivers results for Canadians. And I've heard Mr. O'Toole say, no, we'll just give all the money to the provinces, no strings attached, not a care about whether or not they actually are able to deliver the efficiencies and the proper service needed. And I'm not saying that, and that's a very important and distinctive point. I'm going to make sure that Canadian tax dollars go towards delivering the results that Canadians need. And we've demonstrated with the childcare agreements, for example, that when we set clear targets and are there with sufficient amount of funds to be able to achieve those targets, we can make those agreements with the provinces.
Next question.
Good morning, Christy Kirkup with the Globe and Mail. Today, the Globe published a report showing that children in First Nations communities are dying at a dramatically higher rate due to a clear lack of fire codes and enforceable standards on reserve. In fact, your former PCO clerk says that this is a gap that needs to be addressed and that more Indigenous children will die horrible and preventable deaths if this gap is not closed. So why didn't you do this in government, and will you commit to addressing this hole?
We have committed to closing the gaps in funding, and in outcomes, and in opportunities for Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous children, right across the country. It's been the story of Canada for decades now, that outcomes and opportunities and conditions in Indigenous communities across this country are not adequate, are not comparable to what other Canadians take for granted. And that's why from the very first year we took office, we started working directly in partnership with Indigenous communities and Indigenous leadership across this country to close those gaps. One of the first gaps we closed was the fact that investments in education were at about a third per child in Indigenous communities as what they were in equivalent provincial systems. We've actually closed that gap. There is now parity, but there's more to do. We've made massive investments in housing. We've ended 109 of the 105 long-term boil water advisories that were in place when we got into office. But as you point out, there is more to do on safety, on opportunities, on investments, and we will do that, as we've demonstrated, by investing the necessary funds and creating those partnerships where we put Indigenous leadership and Indigenous peoples at the heart of everything we do on reconciliation.
Following up.
But Mr. Trudeau, if you look behind you, there's a group of kids, and the Ontario Coroner's report has said that First Nations children under the age of 10, that they face a fire mortality rate 86 times greater than non-First Nations children in the province of Ontario, where we are today. So will you commit to addressing this specific legislative gap in Parliament to ensure that First Nations have enforceable fire codes on reserve?
I think everyone understands that there is no one problem that is a standalone problem. First of all, the stats you put forward are horrific and unacceptable. But so is the fact that Indigenous kids are 7 times likely, up to 13 times as likely in some communities, to commit suicide when they're 10 or 11. That the dropout rates, that the addiction rates, that the outcomes for kids in Indigenous communities across this country are on just about every metric worse than those for non-Indigenous kids. And picking, one thing that suddenly is going to be the fix is, I guess it makes for good journalism, but it's not how you solve a systemic, nationwide problem that is multi-layered. Yes, we need to address that issue, and we are working on it. But there are many, many issues we have to address at the same time, and we have to do them not with an Ottawa knows best or a Globe and Mail knows best perspective on it. It has to be a perspective that is driven by Indigenous peoples, their priorities to how they keep their kids safe, how we build a better future. That's what we did on one of the most pressing issues, which was child and family services. Kids continuing to get removed from their communities, from their languages, from their culture, if they were at risk. Well, that is wrong. That's why we worked with Indigenous communities over the past years to co-develop legislation that would keep kids in care in their communities. And that's what we signed in Cowessess First Nation a couple of months ago to demonstrate that Indigenous communities need to be at the center of protecting their kids.
Next question.
Good morning, Ashley Burke, CBC News. Mr. Trudeau, how long do you plan to keep the flags lowered at half-mast at federal buildings, and how will you decide when it's time to raise them?
I plan to keep those flags at half-mast until it is clear that Indigenous peoples are happy to raise them again. I think Canadians have seen with horror those unmarked graves across the country and realize that what happened decades ago isn't part of our history. It is an irrefutable part of our present. The outcomes, the opportunities for Indigenous kids are uneven, are not fair compared to the outcomes for non-Indigenous kids across this country. And even though Indigenous communities have long known that their kids were taken from them, never to return from Indigenous school, from residential schools, Canadians need to know and have woken up to the fact that that is what we have to contend with as a country. So when we decided to bring down those masks, those flags to half-mast, we made the commitment that we would not raise them again until we have worked enough with Indigenous communities and leadership to make a clear determination that it was time to raise them again and continue the hard work of reconciliation. Unlike Mr. O'Toole, who will do it when he feels like it, I will continue to put reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in the hands of Indigenous peoples. Nous avons pris la décision de mettre les drapeaux en berne pour reconnaître cette tragédie des tombes anonymes des enfants autochtones qu'on a découvert à travers le pays. C'était quelque chose que les communautés autochtones savaient depuis longtemps, que les enfants leur ont été enlevés pour ne jamais revenir des écoles résidentielles, des pensionnats autochtones. Et nous n'allons relever ces drapeaux que quand le leadership et les communautés autochtones nous disent que c'est le moment de continuer et de travailler ensemble et on peut les relever. Parce que la réconciliation, ça ne se fait pas quand un politicien à Ottawa décide « OK, c'est fait » ou « Voici, c'est fait ». Comme M. O'Toole qui manque de respect envers les peuples autochtones, nous allons écouter, travailler avec et toujours mettre les peuples autochtones eux-mêmes au centre de nos projets de réconciliation.
Following up.
Could that mean weeks, months, years? What kind of time frame? And also, do you think that people who support Bill 21 themselves hold discriminatory views?
First of all, it'll take the time it takes, but we will continue to work with Indigenous leadership on when the right moment would be to raise those flags once again. I have to say, I was taken aback by the premise of the question last night on Bill 21. My position on this is known. I'm not in favor of that particular law. But it is wrong to suggest that Quebecers are racist. As a Quebecer, I found that question really offensive. I think, yes, there's lots of work to do to continue to fight systemic racism across this country, in every part of this country. But I don't think that that question was acceptable or appropriate because it presumed things in pulling things together that I had a hard time processing even last night. Okay. Tout d'abord, il faut que j'avoue que quand la question a été posée sur la loi 21 hier soir, j'ai été très surpris par le genre d'amalgame qui a été mis là-dedans et j'ai trouvé ça absolument inacceptable et insultant en tant que Québécois. Les Québécois ne sont pas racistes. Je comprends qu'il y a des gens qui sont en désaccord avec la loi 21. J'en suis un. Et je comprends qu'on a encore beaucoup de travail à faire à travers le pays pour lutter contre la discrimination systémique. Mais de peindre toute une nation avec cette brosse, non, moi ça passe pas.
Prochaine question.
Ça peut, bonjour Louis Blouin de Radio-Canada. Ça peut sembler peut-être un peu facile de dire ça aujourd'hui. Pourquoi hier vous n'avez pas réagi plus fortement?
D'abord parce que j'ai été surpris un peu de la question et deuxièmement parce que comme plusieurs gens remarquent, le format n'était pas nécessairement très encourageant pour des interventions et des suivis. La modératrice était en train d'interrompre M. Blanchette pendant qu'il répondait. Je n'allais pas ajouter ma voix à la cacophonie, mais la réalité est que j'ai été un peu étonné que, OK, on commence avec ça. Moi, c'était inacceptable pour moi.
En anglais, s'il vous plaît.
I think, there's a lot of people commenting on the ease of interjecting during this last night's debate or not. The moderator was herself interrupting Mr. Blanchette while he was delivering the answer. I didn't think that adding my voice was right, but quite frankly, I was also taken aback by the assumptions built into that question, which are wrong, because Quebecers are not racist.
En suivi.
Monsieur Blanchette parle d'une chaudière d'insultes au visage des Québécois. Trouvez-vous qu'il exagère dans sa réaction, Monsieur Blanchette, qu'il essaye de se faire du capital politique là-dessus?
Bien, je suis d'accord avec lui que c'était pas... c'était une question qui n'aurait pas dû se poser et des éléments de cette question tiraient des conclusions qui sont inexactes et insultants pour les Québécois. Donc, on se retrouve là-dessus, mais on sait très bien que M. Blanchette cherche à créer des divisions et des contrastes et de la chicane entre le Québec et les Québécois et les autres Canadiens. Et je suis ici en tant que premier ministre, en tant que fier Québécois, pour dire que non, ce n'est pas acceptable d'avoir ces propos-là, mais oui, on va continuer à travailler ensemble pour bâtir un monde meilleur.
Prochaine question.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau. Catherine Lévesque, la presse canadienne. Parlant de chicane, ça fait des mois que François Legault vous dit ne mettez pas des normes nationales dans les CHSLD. Ça fait des mois qu'il vous dit ne mettez pas de conditions en santé. Depuis quelques semaines, ce qu'on voit depuis le début de la campagne électorale, c'est effectivement toutes vos promesses en santé sont liées à des conditions. Vous réitérez votre désir d'avoir des normes nationales en santé. Vous êtes aussi attribué le fait que vous allez créer des dizaines de milliers de places en garderie. Donc, ma question, c'est cette sortie de M. Legault hier pour appuyer les conservateurs, est-ce que c'était très étonnant? Est-ce que vous l'avez peut-être cherché, M. Trudeau?
Je pense que tout d'abord, les Québécois, comme tous les Canadiens, vont faire leur choix pendant cette élection sur le genre de pays, le genre de société dans lequel ils veulent vivre dans les années à venir. Et oui, il y a des enjeux sur lesquels moi je diffère un petit peu de M. Legault. Je crois qu'un gouvernement fédéral a le droit de s'attendre à certains objectifs, certains résultats pour les Canadiens avec l'argent qu'on investit. Mais non, on ne va pas s'immiscer dans la gestion de comment on atteint ces objectifs. L'exemple parfait de cela, c'est nos accords de garderie de petite enfance. On a fixé des normes claires de couper de 50 % les coûts moyens des garderies dans la prochaine année et d'arriver à 10 $ par jour pour toutes les familles à travers le pays dans 5 ans. C'était notre objectif. Et on est en train de négocier très fort avec les provinces pour s'assurer que s'ils vont recevoir les milliards de dollars qu'on va investir, ils vont atteindre ces objectifs. Or, le Québec a déjà atteint et même dépassé ses ambitions et ses objectifs. C'est pour ça qu'on transfère sans condition 6 milliards de dollars pour le gouvernement du Québec, pour les familles. Et non, on ne dit pas comment et où ils doivent l'investir. C'est à M. Legault de décider ça. Mais j'étais à côté de lui en conférence de presse quand il a dit oui, il reste 37 000 places dont on a besoin au Québec et on a l'intention de les combler. C'est son choix. Je pense que les familles québécoises vont avoir vraiment des questions si, même avec ce nouveau 6 milliards de dollars du fédéral, il y a des familles partout au Québec qui sont en train d'attendre sur des listes d'attente interminables sans avoir de place en garderie. Mais oui, on va s'assurer qu'il y a les résultats concrets pour les Canadiens que nous cherchons tous à avoir, y compris au Québec. Et quand on a fait des investissements et signé des ententes avec le Québec sur toutes sortes de choses, on parle toujours des objectifs qu'on veut atteindre. Mais que M. Legault exprime son opinion sur le genre de gouvernement qu'il veut voir, écoutez, moi j'ai passé beaucoup de temps à parler avec mes compatriotes québécois. Et la réalité, c'est que les Québécois veulent que les armes d'assaut restent illégales. Ils veulent un gouvernement qui a encore plus d'ambition pour lutter contre les changements climatiques, pas un gouvernement qui va amener des pipelines de plus. Ils veulent un gouvernement qui va être là pour défendre sans équivoque les droits des femmes. Et le gouvernement que propose M. O'Toole ne fera aucune de ces choses.
En suivi?
Ce matin, le ministre québécois de la Famille dit qu'il n'a pas besoin du 6 milliards de dollars pour compléter le réseau de garderies. Je voulais avoir votre opinion là-dessus. Est-ce que c'est faisable, selon vous?
C'est à lui de gérer cet argent-là. Si, d'une main, il veut compléter le réseau de garderies et ajouter 37 000 places et utiliser le 6 milliards que nous, on renvoie au Québec sans condition pour autre chose, qu'il le fasse. C'est leur choix, il n'y a pas de condition. Mais je sais que si nous, on transfère ces 6 milliards de dollars et le Québec ne choisit pas d'ajouter des places en garderie, il va y avoir pas mal de mères et de familles québécoises qui vont poser des questions sur le choix que fera leur ministre et leur gouvernement québécois. Et je dois souligner encore une fois que ces 6 milliards de dollars vont être retirés, annulés par Aaron O'Toole s'il forme le gouvernement. Et ça, à ce niveau-là, je m'attends à ce que M. Legault pose des questions directes à M. O'Toole sur comment, puisqu'il démontre qu'il ne va pas transférer cet argent-là dans ses coûts, est-ce qu'il veut créer un addendum au prix et au coût de sa plateforme? Il y a un flou là-dedans, mais c'est très clair que M. O'Toole ne va pas être là pour les Québécois, les familles québécoises.
Next question.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. It's Steve Shear with Reuters. We're about 10 days away from the vote, and so far the dominant issue has had nothing to do with policy, really. It's been that Justin Trudeau called a vote in the middle of the fourth wave of the pandemic. I know that hindsight is 2020, but do you regret that decision?
No, absolutely not. I think what we see is a very clear contrast between all the different parties on how we need to move forward as a country. And this is a time when Canadians should get to be very clear about how they want to end this pandemic, how they want to build back better for the future. Because whichever government they elect is going to be making decisions in the coming months, not a year from now, not 2 years from now, but now, about how we move forward. And that is what Canadians get to decide. And I'm looking forward to working with Canadians on even more ambition, on climate change with concrete plans, on childcare at $10 a day, on strengthening gun control. These are the things that Canadians get to choose on, because the choice couldn't be more clear.
Following up.
Your opponents often talk about working together after this vote, including Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole, and that suggests that they expect a minority government either way as a result. Just as an example, today you were speaking of healthcare spending and your plan to tackle COVID. Do you think that you can do those with a minority government?
I think we have seen from the other parties that they do not agree with our vision of how to move forward as a country. We want to make sure that everyone on a plane or train be vaccinated, that federal public servants be vaccinated. And on that, the Conservatives, the Bloc Québécois, and even the Green Party don't agree. On something as basic as how we end this pandemic and build back better, there's no agreement with us on that position. On the question of fighting climate change, the NDP and the Green Party put forward a plan that is completely incoherent and unrealizable, and yet insist that we've done nothing over the past 6 years to fight climate change. I'm sorry, but a price on pollution from coast to coast to coast, and having fought and won against Conservative premiers in the Supreme Court to keep it, is not nothing. Going from 1% of protected coastal and marine areas to 14% in 6 years is not nothing. Protecting historic amounts of our land and waters is not nothing. Moving forward on banning single-use plastics is not nothing. And quite frankly, for the families here in Hamilton, moving steel plants like Dofasco and Algoma and Sault Ste. Marie away from coal towards electric arc is not nothing. And the kind of political, partisan approach that Canadians are seeing from all these different parties in this should highlight both how important it is and how necessary it is for Canadians to make a clear choice on how we move forward together.
Next question.
Hi, Mr. Trudeau. Tom Perry, CBC. You once talked about sunny ways, and you're going very hard on your opponents right now. And I'm wondering if that's what we're going to expect in the final days of the campaign, a negative campaign from your party.
I think our vision for this country is and always will be fundamentally positive. More support for families with $10 a day childcare that leads to more economic growth. Stepping up to end this fight against COVID by ensuring that people get vaccinated and that we're protecting our kids who can't yet get vaccinated. Moving even further on the fight against climate change to create good jobs and to meet our commitments not just to the world, but to future generations. Those are all positive, exciting things that I can't wait to do with Canadians. But they depend upon a choice and very clear contrasts. And even in 2015, I was very clear, even as I was talking about the big, bold, optimistic vision I have for this country that we have delivered over the past 6 years. But even in 2015, as I was laying that out, I was ferocious and unequivocal in my contrasts with where I disagreed with Mr. Harper on policy. And right now, when Erin O'Toole is proposing to bring us back to Harper's approach on climate change, I am going to be ferocious in standing up for Canadians and relentless in pushing forward for the better world I know Canadians want to build together.
Following up.
Yeah, Ms. Freeland said earlier that you're one election away from finally getting childcare done, and I'm wondering if this is such an important issue for you and your party, why you made it contingent on an election. Why didn't you make it a fact on the ground, wait a while, so that it would be harder for whoever wins the next election to tear it down?
Let me be honest. One of the things that we saw from Mr. Harper is there's nothing that you can lock in that some conservative governments aren't willing to reverse, no matter how long it's been around. But more concretely, I will admit to the fact that I didn't expect Erin O'Toole to rip up a $6 billion deal with Quebec, billions of dollars of money for families right across the country, including saving, I think the figure is over $10,000 a year for a family living in downtown Toronto. $6,000 to $8,000 a year for families living here in Hamilton, more than what the Conservatives are on offer. We signed ambitious landmark deals with BC, with Nova Scotia, with Newfoundland and Labrador, with Yukon, with Saskatchewan, with Manitoba, with Quebec, with Prince Edward Island. I'm missing a few. There's 8 of them, provinces and territories. And those are going to make a huge difference for families across this country. And for Erin O'Toole to build his costed platform around pulling back that $30 billion for both families and economic growth was a step further than I expected him to, but it really emphasizes and encapsulates the decision people get to make in this election. Do we continue with the ambitious vision for the future on childcare, but on so many other things as well, on gun control, on climate change? There's lots of really big things that we are in the process of doing on reconciliation. If we change government, all those things, Erin O'Toole has indicated that he will roll them back. That is the choice, and it's a larger choice than just on childcare, even though childcare is a particularly poignant one, both for me and, quite frankly, for families across the country.
Next question.
Good morning, Abigail Beeman, Global News. On Afghanistan, there are reports that a second plane has taken some Canadians out of Kabul. Can you confirm anything about the number of Canadians? And as I asked you last night, anything on the next steps here?
As you see, we are and have been working with our allies in the region, including the Qataris, to ensure that we're able to get Canadians out of Afghanistan, but also keep putting pressure on the Taliban to get people who have Canadian travel documents, including Afghan citizens, out of Afghanistan. We will continue to do that work because I hear it almost every day from Canadians across this country. They want us to do more. They want to welcome tens of thousands, up to 40,000 Afghan families, Afghans and their families to Canada over the coming months.
Following up.
I heard you tell my colleague Tom there that you're going to be ferocious in standing up for what you believe is right for Canadians going forward. I'm wondering, is that your strategy for this final stretch? What do you need to do to pull ahead and come out as the winner?
Fundamentally, it's about trusting Canadians. It's about everything we've done, not just over the past 18 months of having people's backs, but it's also having a pretty good idea of what Canadians want for their future, for their kids' future. Because I've heard people loudly and clearly over the past years. They want us to do even more on the fight against climate change while ensuring good jobs and a growing economy. We're doing that. We're going to be doing that even more. They want more supports for families with things like childcare. They need more help on housing. When Erin O'Toole's proposal on housing is to give a $500 million tax break to the wealthiest landlords, that's not what families need. We will continue to deliver what Canadians need, and I have confidence that Canadians know that the only way to move from here is forward, not back.
Next question.
Hi, Prime Minister. Kate Bolingaro from Bloomberg. Since we're back in Hamilton, and you just brought up housing, so it's very convenient for me, I'm wondering if you think that the tax on the biggest bank profits could backfire by actually making home purchases less affordable, since these tax increases are often passed on to borrowers.
That is a concern that people addressed when we first brought out that our housing plan, and I was happy to point out, and our ministers were happy to point out, that actually we will be strengthening the tools that an independent oversight body has to ensure that there are no excessive fees passed along to Canadians. We need to make sure that the money we're putting forward to help Canadians save for a new home, to defend Canadians' rights, the rights of home buyers when they get into this market, and that we're working with municipalities investing billions of dollars to create 1.4 million homes over the coming years actually gets passed on. So yes, we are asking Canada's biggest, most profitable financial institutions to do a little more, because Canadians have sacrificed so much, and we know they will.
Following up.
How will you actually concretely, though, stop the banks from passing on those costs? What kind of teeth is this agency actually going to have to really prevent the average person that just wants to buy a house, and you want to support them doing that? How are you actually going to concretely do that? Thank you.
Well, that's exactly what it's the Financial Consumer Protection Agency, or some such thing that has existed for a while, that we will give further tools to and funding to ensure that it can do an even stronger job of ensuring that consumers of financial services across this country are properly protected.
We'll take one last local question.
Samantha Craigs from the CBC News in Hamilton. How would a Liberal government address Indigenous land claims that are increasingly creating conflict in Caledonia and concern along the Grand River?
I think we've demonstrated that our approach over the past years has been to engage constructively and productively and try and problem solve. Be there with resources and funding to look at how to solve these problems. We've settled litigation and claims to the billions of dollars for past errors that governments made over the decades with Indigenous peoples. We've demonstrated a desire to move forward in partnership, and every situation is different, but the work that Ministers Miller and Bennett and others are doing on solving these challenges in respect and at the pace dictated by Indigenous communities is ongoing. And fundamentally, particularly in places like you named, we need to rebuild trust and demonstrate our commitment to solving this, not just shrugging it off, because that's what's happened far too often over the past many decades. We will continue to be there as patient and willing partners as we support communities as they determine their path forward.
One last quick question. It's the final stretch of the campaign. You're in Hamilton again. How's your party doing here?
I'm very, very excited about the amazing candidates we have. I've heard from people I've actually met in the street, even just this morning on leaving the hotel, how our candidates are out there knocking on doors, having the direct conversations with people about the future we want to build for Hamiltonians and indeed all Canadians. And when you think about the families here in Hamilton that are struggling with childcare costs, that want to build a better future for their kids, that are worried about the healthcare system that they rely on as case numbers continue to rise amongst the unvaccinated, I know our candidates are the leaders and the ones with the plan that is going to build a better future for families here in Hamilton and indeed right across the country.
Thank you so much. This is what ends today's press conference.
Merci tout le monde.